Morning everyone, and welcome to my reflections for Sunday the 19th of September. Now as we look at the readings for today, and we're continuing our journey through Mark's Gospel, and now up to Mark chapter 9, one of the unique elements we see throughout Mark's Gospel, and something which he keeps coming back to and keeps reminding us of, is the disciples' lack of understanding. At times, the disciples are often depicted as being confused, challenged, or even discouraged by the things that Jesus is teaching them. For example, in today's Gospel passage, Mark reports that after Jesus predicts his passion, that the disciples did not understand what he was saying to them, to the extent that they were too afraid to ask him to clarify it. Now, as we know over the last few weeks, this isn't the first time that the disciples have heard Jesus predict his death. Last week, we know when Jesus forecasts his passion and his death, Peter tries to stop him, and Peter subsequently gets rebuked, and Jesus accuses him of doing the work of the devil in trying to, stop the plan of God being worked out. Now, to understand the disciples' incomprehension, their fear of asking Jesus to explain himself, and as we go into today's story, their subsequent arguments over who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven and who's the greatest amongst the disciples, we need to understand the disciples' state of mind. Now, as we look back through the gospel, we see that Jesus has already given them the answer for why they have a difficulty in understanding what he is saying. He said, because their minds are not set on divine things, but on human things. Now, I think that's, as you reflect on that's an easy thing to say and an easy thing to agree with, that the disciples were more earthly focused than they were heavenly focused. In many ways, that's true for most of us, most of our lives, as we continue our journey of faith. But remember, Jesus is talking to disciples. He's talking to people who had left behind their families. They'd left behind all they owned. They'd left behind their income, their professions. These are not people who are casual followers. They have given up a great deal to follow Jesus, to spend this time with him, wandering around the countryside, hearing him speak, seeing him perform miracles, healing the sick, casting out demons, even giving life to the dead. So for Jesus to say to them, you've not got your mind set on heavenly things, must have been difficult, because they had given up so much from a human perspective to follow Jesus. But Jesus, in his discourse with them and in this continuing pattern as it develops over these chapters in Mark's Gospel, is now saying that whatever they have given up to follow him, the time is coming when this is coming to an end. And maybe it's that aspect that the disciples can't wrap their heads around the most. They've given up a great deal to follow him. They've seen their lives enriched as a result of the things he's done and said, and they've grown to love him and respect him. And now they fear losing him. They fear losing themselves in that process. The threat, in many ways, that Jesus said about the threat to his own life was also a threat to the disciples, because they were in danger of losing this new life that they had given much up to follow. However, if we look at the words of Jesus to the disciples, we see that Jesus does not solely predict his death and passion, but also his resurrection. And there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between what Jesus is saying and what the disciples hear. Did the disciples stop listening to Jesus after the first half of his sentence, when he refers to his death? Was their anxiety, was their fear so great that they didn't actually hear the end of the sentence that Jesus was saying, that he was going to be resurrected? If they did hear that, why were they not curious about it? Why did they not ask him, well, what do you mean you're going to be resurrected? Surely that would have been the thing to focus on rather than his death. But for the disciples, it was the fear of confronting the death of Jesus that stopped them hearing the other things he had to say to them. And as the story continues, Mark tells us that on their journey to Capernaum, Jesus overhears the disciples arguing about who among them is the greatest. A topic of discussion that the disciples were too embarrassed to mention to Jesus when he asked them what they were arguing about. They remained silent. But Jesus knew what they were arguing about, just as he knew the disciples' confusion and fear about him speaking about his death. And I think the way Jesus deals with these situations, ones of fear, ones of anxiety, ones of trying to distract and look at something else, I think the way Jesus deals with it is so wonderful. And he uses a wonderful example of how they should think of one another. Jesus acts out a parable. He takes a child, puts the child in the middle of the disciples, and then, as it says specifically, and I think with great purpose, he takes the child into his arms and says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not just me, but the one who sent me." Now, to fully understand the impact of that and what I feel is behind why Jesus used that moment, to use that particular example with the child, you need to understand the role of children in the ancient world. In that first century Mediterranean world, the characteristic feature of children was not their innocence, but their lack of status, their lack of any legal rights whatsoever. Jesus is not teaching the disciples a lesson as we often tend to interpret it today, a lesson about being childlike, but he's speaking to the subject of status. Remember, they're arguing about who is the greatest. He's making a point about status, not about innocence. Embracing children, contrary to their cultural evaluation as people with no rights, was something which was a real characteristic of the early church. So they eventually got the message, I believe, that Jesus was trying to tell them. He was saying that if you're followers of me, then you have to accept the least and the lowly. Not because, that they're innocent, but just because that's what we should do as Christians. We accept the weak, the downtrodden, the lonely, the isolated, the persecuted. And he uses a child who had no rights whatsoever as the example of how to get that message over to the disciples. In many ways, the child is not a visual aid for a lesson that Jesus wants to teach, but the child is shown to belong with the congregation. Those who receive a child, or those who receive anyone who has no rights, they receive Jesus. And if they receive Jesus, they also receive the one who sent him. We should avoid all point just looking and welcoming those of position and status or wealth. We should always receive people of no status, no position, the marginalised, those whom others shun or would rather didn't exist. And in that moment, in that wonderful example, the disciples' fear and uncertainty about Jesus' death and their argument amongst themselves about who is the greatest is suddenly disrupted. Jesus, in that simple act of bringing a child into their midst, reminds them what it means, what it truly means to be one of his disciples. To be a disciple of Jesus is above all a way of being in the world. It's not so much in many ways about what we say we believe or knowing the creed and all the elements of our faith. It's about welcoming others as we have been welcomed by Jesus. We who were sinners, we who were far off, have been welcomed and embraced by the love of God in Jesus. And that has to be our attitude towards other people. To be a true disciple of Jesus means creating enough space in our hearts and minds to welcome those who are desperate to meet Jesus and who are desperate of hearing of God's love for them. And sometimes as it meant for the disciples, that may mean putting our own selves aside, our own desires aside, so that we may sacrificially follow Jesus' example and offer love and hospitality and grace to those who so desperately need it. To be a disciple of Jesus, as Jesus makes it clear to his disciples, is to set our hearts and minds on divine things and not on human things. The God who reaches out to each and every one of us when we were far from him. Jesus comes to us and welcomes us into his presence so that we can welcome him in the people he then sends to us. And as it did for Jesus himself, that may mean that we need to see things from a heavenly perspective and not an earthly one. And if doing that again, as it did for Jesus, involves sacrifice and hardship for ourselves, we also know that through his love we now have that wonderful promise that a day of resurrection will come. And that day lies ahead for all of us who believe and follow in his way. So today, whatever earthly things are concerning you, frustrating you, filling you with excitement or fear, today just take some time to set your minds on heavenly things. Remind yourself of God's amazing love for you. Remind yourself of what Jesus did for you. And then as you go out into the world, or you chat to people on the phone, whatever you do, be reminded that Jesus longs for you to welcome others as he has welcomed you. There's no need to worry or fuss about our status or our position. The most important thing for us all to remember is that we are a child who is loved by God. We are his child. And through Jesus and through the suffering and resurrection of Jesus, that will always be true. So let's rejoice in that, and let us look to do all we can to welcome others as he has welcomed us. Amen. Okay, so that's it for today. I'll see you with my reflection next week. Until then, keep praying, keep believing, and keep safe. God bless.